Hello, everybody. Hello, all you nice, friendly, chill, relaxed, kind people. Smart, good-looking, cute. You know, it was so cool because people just weren't like correcting each other. They were like listening. It was really, really special. Thank you, everybody, for this incredible time. So, first of all, we have to thank a few people. 5 people created this conference, and I'm going to say their names again because we were like that. We were so united in our vision, and our vision completely came true. The first is the executive director of CLAGS, Jim Wilson. And where are you? If you ever need someone to run your ship, he's the guy. And then Yasmina Savanovich and Ben Gillespie and Matt Brim. Thank you so much. So, you know, here we are. Some are academics, some are activists, some are artists, some are all. And, you know, our job as thinkers and producers of ideas is to look into the invisible and see the structures that are hidden there, that are not named and that are not known, but that are controlling our lives. And to articulate those structures in a way that makes them visible so that we all have choices and awareness about how we want to live. And I think, you know, the holy grail of that endeavor is to understand something and explain it with so much clarity that everyone who you care about can use it in a way that elevates their own thinking and their own lives. And that is what Jasbir has done with the articulation of homonationalism. It's been so useful to all of us, and I'm grateful to you. Thank you, and you should feel good. That's right. So we're now going to hear from Jasbir, and then we'll have Q&A and comments after. Welcome, Jasbir.
Good evening. It's great to see all of you. I'm honored to be here and pretty overwhelmed, actually, as well. And I thank all of you for coming. I wanted to just start by thanking Sarah Schulman for her work in organizing the conference and for her amazing commitment and energy and determination. So the last 2 days have been full of insightful and inspiring and wide-ranging presentations in a forum that perhaps some of you don't know faced institutional and political hurdles that Sarah kind of diligently worked through over the last year and a half, I guess, yeah. And an event that, you know, garnered animosity in the press, et cetera. So none of this would have happened without her. So thank you very much, Sarah. And I also want to thank CLAGS as well for undertaking this event. So it seems a good moment then to take stock of what's happened here at the conference and also to think about ways of moving forward. It's been less than 6 years since the publication of Terrorist Assemblages, in which I developed and named the concept of homonationalism. And I can tell many, many funny stories about what it took to come up with the term homonationalism, which was in no way obvious. It was not an obvious or easy word to kind of come up with. I've been no less than continually surprised that a book written to satisfy the specialized demands of academic tenure has been read and used by such a wide range of people across disciplines. So feminist and queer theory, affect studies, religious studies, political theory, and so on. And it has also crossed the academic activist species divide many times over, resonating with organizing work underway in various parts of Europe, the Middle East, India, and the United States. So these past 2 days, we've seen papers ranging from homonationalism in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, South Asia, and on a range of topics including gentrification, settler colonialism, anti-occupation activism, the corporatization of academia, incarceration, just to name a few. In many ways, the conversations here resonate and are connected to numerous academic activist collaborative forums in the United States in the 90s that interrogated the relations of sexuality to nationalism. So I'm thinking specifically of the Black Nations, Queer Nations Conference, and also the CLAGS 1998 conference that I believe was called Local Homosexualities Global Queer, or something like that. There was also a kind of disastrous conference in Amsterdam a couple years ago on sexual nationalisms, which I know many of you know about, that actually was so unlike this conference, so incredibly politically problematic, and so dismayingly, dishearteningly destructive in a lot of ways. So this conference is really, this forum is really a tribute to specific kinds of priorities around organizing practices, around anti-racist critical paradigms, and really thinking across activist academic binaries. So the debates in these earlier conferences were largely about the circuits of queer activism and queer theory that might reproduce neo-colonial frameworks of identity, sometimes unwittingly, in attempting to challenge nationalist formations. So if we are here in a moment of vigorous critique of the state and of our own activist and academic practices, it is both linked to these earlier efforts, for sure, but is also from a distinctly different vantage point, and I would say that of homonationalism. So terrorist assemblages was not intended as a corrective by any means, rather an incitement to generative and constructive debate. And it's been incredibly humbling and inspiring to see how homonationalism, humiliating, also humiliating, no question. Here I am, feeling very humiliated. To see how this concept has been deployed and adapted and re-articulated and critiqued. Homonationalism actually started coming together for me as a concept within the US context and was fueled by the lessons that I learned from years of organizing in the Bay Area in the 90s with Asian domestic abuse and anti-violence groups. Specifically, I was working with NARICA, which is a domestic violence helpline for South Asian women, and also the Asian Women's Network in San Francisco, and Tricone as well, which is the first ever established South Asian queer organization in the Bay Area. And then also in New York with the South Asian Lesbian and Gay Association in the early 2000s, and then with numerous groups in the aftermath of September 11th, 2001, most especially with the Audre Lorde Project in New York City. Beginning then in the 90s, they became increasingly concerned with this standard refrain of transnational feminist discourse, as well as of queer theories that vociferated that the nation is heteronormative and that the queer is inherently an outlaw to the nation state. I challenged the hegemonic queer outlier paradigm through the concept of homonationalism, which named the use of acceptance and tolerance for gay and lesbian subjects as the barometer by which the legitimacy and capacity for national sovereignty is evaluated. While the project arose within the post-9/11 political era of the United States, my intent in Terrorist Assemblages was not only to demonstrate a relationality of the instrumentalization of queer bodies by the US state, or only the embracing of nationalist and often xenophobic and imperialist interests of the US by queer communities. Rather, building on the important work of Lisa Dugan on homonormativity, her theorization of the imbrication of privatization of neoliberal economies and the growth of domestic acceptance of queer communities, homonationalism fundamentally highlights a critique of how lesbian and gay liberal rights discourses produce narratives of progress and modernity that continue to accord some populations access to cultural and legal forms of citizenship at the expense of the partial and full expulsion from those rights of other populations. Simply stated, from that project, homonationalism is the concomitant rise in the legal, consumer, and representative recognition of LGBTQ subjects and the curtailing of welfare provisions, immigrant rights, and the expansion of state power to surveil, detain, and deport. The narrative of progress for gay rights is thus built on the backs of racialized and sexualized others for whom such progress was either once achieved but is now backsliding or has yet to arrive. This process relies on the shoring up of the respectability of homosexual subjects in relation to the performative reiteration of the pathologized, perverse homo and hetero sexuality of racial others, in specific at this particular moment, Muslim others upon whom Orientalist and Neo-Orientalist projections are cast. However, in Terrorist Assemblages, I looked not only at the proliferation of queerness as a white Christian secular norm, but also at the proliferation of homonationalism in Arab, Muslim, and South Asian queer communities in the United States, where forms of Hindu secularism and Indian nationalism often converge. So I just want to emphasize that initially this was not simply a critique of the racial exclusions and whitenesses of mainstream LGBT communities. And this is important to me, that this is, in thinking about the convergences around liberalism and racism, that racisms are actually what's at play. When I first started thinking about the relationships between modernity, nationalism, and sexuality, it was in the context of my dissertation research in Trinidad, where I was looking at gay and lesbian organizing and Afro-Trinidadian, Indo-Trinidadian race relations, as it was termed at that time. And basically, I was understanding that even though homosexuality was banned by the Constitution, there was still an imaginary around who that homosexual would be, and that it was understood that Afro-Indian, Indo-Trinidadians were actually not progressive enough to be that banned homosexual. So already in that configuration between Afro and Indo-Trinidadians, I was understanding a particular version of how homonationalism was operating. Homonationalism, thus, is not simply a racism for gay, it's not simply a synonym for gay racism or another way to mark how gay and lesbian identities become available to conservative political imaginaries. I do not think of homonationalism as an identity or a position or an accusation. It is not another marker meant to cleave a good, progressive, transgressive, politically left queer from a bad, sold-out, conservative, politically bankrupt queer. As an analytic, it most forcefully attends to apprehending the consequences of the successes of LGBT liberal rights movements. As such, I think of it more as a structuring facet of modernity rather than an aberration or a liberalism gone bad, and also as a historical shift marked by the entrance of some homosexual bodies as worthy of protection by nation states, a constitutive and fundamental reorientation of the relationship between the state, capitalism, and sexuality. In other words, homonationalism is here to stay, and we kind of have to deal with it. So understood then as an analytics of power, this historical moment can be called homonational to the extent that one must engage homonationalism in the first place as the condition of possibility for national and transnational politics. So this evening, with some brevity, I'm going to try to elaborate on what homonationalism as assemblage is, with particular reference to what I think has been possibly the most generative and engendering intervention at this conference, that of thinking through settler colonialism and what Scott Morgenson calls settler homonationalism. So while Terrorist Assemblages has been picked up for its intervention around homonationalism, there's also a methodological and political challenge in the book produced through the use of a kind of dual approach with intersectionality and assemblage theory. And there's been kind of a bifurcated taking up of the book. There's been folks who have been interested in homonationalism, but have been uninterested in the methodological challenge around identity that the book was invested in. And then there have been plenty of people who have been interested in assemblage theory, but who have actually not been interested in the politics attached to how that assemblage theory was worked out. So I'm still thinking about what that kind of bifurcated take-up has meant and means in terms of kind of political organizing and theory. And I've seen a lot of papers here and heard a lot of papers here that really did kind of fantastic thinking around assemblage and politics. Through Deleuzian assemblage, in French originally termed agencement, which loosely means patterning of arrangements, homonationalism is rearticulated as a field of power rather than an activity or property of any one nation state, organization, or individual. Homonationalism is an assemblage of de- and re-territorializing forces, affects, energies, and movements. Assemblages do not accrete in linear time or within discrete histories, fields, or discourses. In naming a movement in contemporary US queer politics, homonationalism is only useful in how it offers a way to track historical shifts in the terms of modernity, even as it has become mobilized within the very shifts it was produced to name. We can debate the pros and cons about the instrumentalization of sexual identity by human rights frames and by the state, but we cannot elide what I would argue is the crux of the problem, the insistence of or default to the notion of identity itself. And here I'm defining identity as an affective attachment, a daily habituation of affect. What this also means then, I'm proposing, is that we are all subjects produced through, not despite or against, homonationalism. And this may especially be the case if the settler colonial subject is a homonationalist subject or a subject that emerges in part through homonationalism, and I'll return to this point later. This then leaves us with very complex questions about agency and accountability, which no longer is necessarily discretely located in singular human bodies or concrete entities, but rather dispersed across numerous actors, or to hail Bruno Latour, actants. In this sense, homonationalism is an analytic category deployed to understand and historicize how and why a nation's status as gay-friendly has become desirable in the first place. Like modernity, homonationalism can be resisted and resignified, but not exactly opted out of. We are all produced as subjects through it, even if we are against it. To be specific then, how I have elaborated elsewhere on each of these points in the context of how a practice such as Israeli pinkwashing becomes legible on a global scale, I would define homonationalism as assemblage as follows, as composed of, first of all, the understanding of homonationalism as a structure of modernity, connected to another enduring structure of modernity, that of the nation state, a convergence of geopolitical and historical forces, neoliberal interests in capitalist accumulation, both cultural and material, so we can see the rise of the queer as a consumer in line with other niche markets, biopolitical state practices of population control, and affective investments in discourses of freedom, liberation, and rights. And we most often see those affective investments mobilized in gay and lesbian human rights frames. So homonationalism as assemblage is thus also a process, not an event or an attribute. It names this historical shift in the production of nation states from the insistence on heteronormativity to the increasing inclusion of homonormativity. This process coheres not through September 11th as a solitary temporal moment. September 11th sometimes seems to function as an originary trigger, fostering a dangerous historical reification around what is sometimes cynically referred to in the United States as the 9/11 industry. Looking back now through the moment of 9/11, my interest in terrorist assemblages has been in the 40-year span of the era of the post-civil rights era that through the politics of liberal inclusion continued to produce the sexual other as white and the racial other as straight, And in the context of the United States, people like Nyan Shah and Siobhan Somerville and Ethna Lupe are producing these particular earlier histories, right, of how this bifurcation is continually being historically produced. Certainly September 11th revealed and drew to the surface forms of Islamophobia that, as Edward Said has argued, were already tremors in the era of decolonization. There are two issues of temporality at stake here, one of historicization and periodization, and the other of teleological progression. They are obviously linked issues. What was homonationalism before we started calling it homonationalism? How would we historicize homonationalism as a process that long predates the advent of the term and its emergence post-September 11th? What are the historical convergences necessary for homonationalism to take hold? If we name something within the terms of homonationalism, are we then also yoking it to the confines of the US, of Islamophobia, of the war on terror, periodization, of what Joseph Massad calls Islam as other and Islam used to other? And what prior histories might this periodization obfuscate? And how are our own namings looping back in to produce discursive sedimentation of the very forces of power we are attempting to challenge? One answer to these questions about history comes from the brilliant interventions at this conference and in general of Indigenous studies scholars such as Scott Morganson and J. Kehaulani Kanau, for whom homonationalism is an old formation, indeed a structuring one. Homonationalism produces not only the homo in certain relation to nation states, but it also reifies a version of nationalism and the nation as one that naturalizes the nation as a settler colonial nation and normalizes its subjects as unreconstructed settlers. If homonationalism elucidates processes of nationalism as much as of the homosexual identities that nationalism takes up, then one of the most powerful turns that the study of homonationalism could take and seems to be taking, especially at this conference, is to address the structuring violence of the nation state, and in this case of the US nation state. And that would be that of slavery as the primal scene of American racism, and then the erasure of settler colonialism that attends that continual reproduction of blackness as the original injury of racism. So I'm trying to say something here about how dismantling of these two related foundational narratives is about establishing a kind of co-constitutive ground from which to address injustice. And it seems like one foundational narrative works to eclipse another foundational narrative. And so what would it mean to actually address these things, these two things together? And in part, I'm really motivated by Scott Morganson's understanding of settler colonialism as a kind of citational praxis of recognition now to invoke it that doesn't actually then think through the enduring structures that allow for that citational praxis to be somehow enough in terms of a politics of solidarity. This was actually the very simple point that Maya Mikdashi and I were making in the work that we were doing, that anti-pinkwashing organizing, particularly specifically in the US, in solidarity with Palestine, can unwittingly pinkwash global North locations and thus naturalize settler colonialism. So then another set of questions about this post-9/11 period. If securitization becomes a prime discourse through which deviant bodies are preemptively controlled, manifesting the figure of the Muslim terrorist, which precarious bodies are susceptible to this dynamic prior to 9/11? Might we want to address an older discourse of securitization, what Denise Ferreira da Silva calls the security turn, encouraged through moral panics around race and crime in the 1960s that further embolden the prison industrial complex and lead to our current rates of hyperincarceration of African and Latino Americans? Can we theorize the relation of driving while black, for instance, to flying while brown, as one way in which homonationalism or at least the theory of it, problematically shifts the registers of racial and economic precarity. And in the post 9/11 period, which I would say begins in the US with the financial crisis of 2008, might we want to once again address the shifting figurations of precarity and those bodies that are being criminalized for producing precarity, even as they are the very bodies consigned to living precariously. And here I just want to say something about what it means to think about precarity multiply and think about multiple precarious bodies. And here I do depart from Judith Butler in her thinking that we are all kind of involved in a shared precarity. I'm more interested in thinking about how multiple precarities are actually the starting point for addressing a politics around biopolitics. So given these questions, is there something exceptional about how nation states have come to understand homosexuality as a rubric through which biopolitical control can be leveraged? Is there something exceptional about homosexuality that produces this leverage? The answer, I would think, from the historical vantage of colonialism is no. As I've argued elsewhere, the homosexual question comes to supplement the woman question of the decolonization movement era, and this era has obviously not come to pass in terms of many regimes of settler colonialism, to modulate arbitration between modernity and tradition. As elaborated by Partha Chatterjee and others, this question arose with some force in the decolonization movements in South Asia and elsewhere, whereby the capacity for an emerging post-colonial government to protect Native women from oppressive patriarchal cultural practices marked as tradition became the barometer by which colonial rule arbitrated political concessions made to the colonized. In other words, we rehearse here Gayatri Spivak's famous dictum, white men saving brown women from brown men. We can also say that while the woman question has hardly disappeared, the homosexual question produces the fantasy that the unequal status of women has been resolved. And this is the unfortunate fallout of liberal feminisms, and also, unfortunately, the institutionalization of women's studies in the United States and Europe. The terms of the woman question have been redictated as feminist scholars have now become the arbiter of other women's modernity, or the modernity of the other woman. To re-invoke Spivak for the 21st century, white women saving brown women from brown men, or in terms of the homosexual question, white queer men saving brown homosexual men from brown heterosexuals. So it's not a good way to, there's no good way to say that. I'm open to suggestions. I've been soliciting suggestions for years around that now. So at its most basic level, we could say that homonationalism is an analytic that helps us apprehend the historical emergence of the relevance of this question. How well do you treat your homosexuals? This civilizational barometer question keeps on morphing, keeps on producing and inciting new questions and new figures that are drawn into function for the alibis of liberal democracy's transgression. Transgender rights are the civil rights issue of our time, so stated Vice President Joe Biden just one week before the November 2012 election. Months earlier, President Obama had publicly declared his support for gay marriage, sending mainstream LGBT organizations and queer liberals into a tizzy. Though an unexpected comment for an election season and nearly inaudibly rendered during the course of a conversation with a concerned mother of Miss Trans New England, Biden's remark, encoded in the rhetoric of recognition, seemed logical from a now well-established civil rights era teleology, first the people of color, then the homosexuals, and now the trans folk. There was, of course, healthy skepticism from the appropriate reliable quarters, trans grassroots activists asking the important questions about welfare, safety, work, economics, and healthcare. We could ask again then what happens to women's rights in this telos. We could note, as many have, that failing an intersectional analysis of these movements, we are left indeed with a very partial portrait of who benefits and how from these according of rights, not to mention their tactical invocation within this period of late liberalism, whereby, as Beth Povinelli argues, potentiality has been domesticated. As C. Riley Norton and Jin Harithrawarn argue, quote, "It is necessary to interrogate how the uneven institutionalization of women's, gay, and trans politics produces a transnormative subject whose universal trajectory of coming out, transition, visibility, recognition, protection, and self-actualization largely remain uninterrogated in its complicities and convergences with biomedical, neoliberal, racist, and imperial projects. Thus, while global feminist and homonormative anti-violence politics have been subject to critique, the same is not true for a comparable trans politics," end quote. And they remark on the kind of barely conceivable trans of color positions. We might ask questions then about whether Biden's acknowledgement of transgender rights signals the uptake of a new variant of homonationalism, a trans homonationalism, generating a new figure through which the successes of rights discourses will produce new biopolitical failures. Two other examples of the processes of homonationalism in the US are painfully illustrative of the uneven and perhaps constitutive violences of rights discourses. The ban on homosexuals in the US military, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, was repealed, as you know, on December 18th, 2010, the same day that the US Senate put a halt to the DREAM Act, the Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors Act, a piece of legislation that would have legalized millions of undocumented students and allowed them to pursue higher education, and ironically enough, military enlistment. In the fall of 2009, the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd hate crime legislation, the first federal legislation criminalizing hate crimes against gays, lesbians, and trans, was passed, ironically in large part because it was attached to a military appropriations bill. So much for queer progress that doesn't support the war on terror. But even before it was known that the bill was being manipulated to reinforce militaristic ends, the Audre Lorde Project, Queers for Economic Justice, the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, Fierce, and Incite jointly released a statement taking a stand against the purportedly historic passage of this bill, arguing that legal intervention would be so detrimental it would be better not to criminalize these specific hate crimes. These organizations posited that the hate crime legislation would allocate greater resources for the militarization of police forces and the administrative surveillance and harassment of people of color, especially youth of color, already profiled as more homophobic than their white counterparts, and in particular Latinos and African Americans, whose disproportionate incarceration in the United States is a known fact. Historically, then, in the US, these populations have not been able to depend on protection from the state and the police from violence, but rather have been the targets of violence from these purportedly protective services. Further, new populations cohere through the gathering of statistical, demographic, financial, and personal information to move those understood as targets of hate crime into the purview of knowledge production to become the objects of state surveillance under the purported guise of being the subjects of state protection. And Chandan Reddy does a really fantastic read of this bill in his book, Freedom with Violence. These cautions about the limited efficacy of legal intervention were completely dismissed or not even recognized, actually, by mainstream national gay and lesbian organizations, nor did these organizations comment upon the severe and unfair effects of the compromises made in order to enable its passage. And I'll just mention here, in this context, of course, the case of Tyler Clementi's suicide and Darun Ravi's prosecution, and New Jersey's anti-bullying laws, which are now the toughest in the country, which nonetheless still cannot keep collegiate athletes from being bullied by their coaches. The war on terror, however, covered over and continues to cover over quote-unquote homegrown exclusions, and thus homonationalism as a heuristic can work to reorganize its own critical force by thinking in time with settler colonial studies. And I have written elsewhere about how gay marriage works to produce cleavages between the good race subjects and the bad raced subjects, to demonize religion and religious subjects, and also in particular in relation to Prop 8, actually, in terms of religion and race, but also in Europe, how gay marriage has been used as a securitization discourse. The recent debates on gay marriage and the gay equality debates in the US remind me that in my thinking about homonationalism and its interests in legal recognition, I had actually forgotten that in 1993, Hawaii was on the verge of becoming the first state to legalize gay marriage. The Bear versus Lewin case was the first successful challenge to the denial of same-sex marriage in any state Supreme Court in the United States, and was also unique because the case was made on the basis of equal protection under the law, regardless of sex, rather than sexual orientation, heeding to the prohibition of sex discrimination in the Hawaii Constitution, which at the time contained more elaborate and specific stipulations than did the federal Constitution. So further progressive interpretations of same-sex marriage in this particular instance included its detachment from homosexuality, so you could have a same-sex marriage but be heterosexual. As one justice wrote, homosexual and same-sex marriages are not synonymous. A heterosexual same-sex marriage is not, in theory, oxymoronic. Parties to a union between a man and a woman may or may not be homosexuals. Parties to a same-sex marriage could theoretically be homosexuals or heterosexuals. Other factors made Hawaii a unique case, a tradition of liberalism indebted to complex heterogeneity of populations and discourses of tolerance, recourse to pre-discovery culture and colonial histories of Hawaii, whereby homosexual relations have a certain kind of cultural alibi or a cultural history, very recent state ratification in 1959, activist movements that claim illegal US occupation and agitate for sovereignty rights. Also significant were the forms of anti-same-sex marriage organizing that took shape in response to its potential legalization. The LGBT section of the American Friends Service Committee stood in solidarity with sovereignty rights activists to argue that the legalization of same-sex marriage would further entrench a tourist industry that has been increasingly seen as antagonistic to sovereignty claims. These early critiques of same-sex marriage campaigns have been lost, it seems to me. And it strikes me that if this history of same-sex marriage animated the gay marriage debates of today, or had been animating the gay marriage debates, we might be talking about different notions of equality, of sovereignty, of homonationalism, and sexual rights. And so I really wonder, why does the Hawaii case keep getting lost in the history of gay marriage in the United States? And why is the mainland history the history that keeps taking over the way in which we're talking about gay marriage, especially when that mainland history begins with some of the whitest states in the country, like Vermont. No offense to Vermont. And again, I think this is indicative of the ways in which settler colonialism continued to be enacted as a form of citational solidarity, but not something that reorganizes the structures through which we are actually organizing and analyzing things. So the conclusion here is called, So What Does Homonationalism as Assemblage Do? In closing, I want to suggest the importance of moving away from the call and response process that continues to rely on opposing a mainstream global queer against a queer of color or a non-Western queer. And in some ways, and I don't want to get into a long discussion about Joseph Massad, but Massad's work is correct, of course, about the history of sexuality and about the travels of the master sign of sexuality through colonial administrative institutions. But his accusations about the Gay International continue to reify the distinctions between the West and the rest that he insists should be undermined and challenged. I have discussed the travels of the concept of homonationalism and how it has been taken up and in some ways, sometimes reduced to an organizing platform akin to a political critique of racism and nationalism in queer communities. There's so many long, long histories of those critiques that we have actually, many of us have been a part of already. It has also been used as an applied analytic to assess the level or quality of the homonationalist state. But instead of theorizing homonationalism as an identity position or as an adjective that denounces a state or another entity, again, I have been thinking about homonationalism as an analytic to apprehend state formation and a structure of modernity. With this understanding of homonationalism as assemblage, what it means for homonationalism as concept to go viral, as it were, is quite distinct from a reproductive application. And so one example of this reproductive application is that wherever I am in the world, I get asked to comment on that nation-state's relationship to homonationalism, regardless of my lack of knowledge about that part of the world. So the last time I was in Sweden, I was asked by a local newspaper, can you please tell us how homonationalism works in Sweden? And I said, no, I can't. So this was what I mean about this kind of reductive or reproductive application. Taking up further sexuality as assemblage and not identity, a strand of sexuality theory invested in thinking about assemblages and viral reproduction rather than reproductive futurism, the aforementioned call and response relay that continues to dominate the mainstream global queer versus queer of color, non-Western queer logic of argumentation is one that often fails to interrogate the complex social field within which queer is being produced as a privileged signifier across these boundaries. Following this strand of autocritical theory, then, we might be interested in how homonationalism as concept has already become embedded in and part of the assemblage that is homonationalism, insofar as the discursive travels of the concept virally replicate and thus mutate the assemblage. The concept of homonationalism and the critique have been wonderfully uprooted from its origins, adapted, redeployed to suit different needs, different strategies, different politics. It's not reliant on any singular definition. And this is what this conference has really highlighted for me as well. It has created synergy across and through various political movements and struggles, and has generated capacious theoretical paradigms, as well as important debates about the relationships between academia and activists, theory and praxis. This prolific taking up of and moving around is what I would say the ultimate articulation of homonationalism as assemblage. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to open it up. Now we have mics on both aisles, and since this is live streaming, you need to speak into the mics, so you can please line up. You're invited to ask questions, make comments, and also to make any kind of general observations or comments about the experiences you've had in the last 2 days related to these issues or thinking them through. And don't be shy. Okay. And also, could you please say your name?
Yes, I will. Hi, can you hear me? Yes. My name is Doha, and I will not sound smart as you, but even though I decided to take the risk and ask anyway, so just, after you, like, nobody want to speak because you sound very smart. So, like, that's why I think everybody's
scared. I just sound smart.
Yeah.
It's a skill.
So, so the experience at the conference has been very, like, eye-opening, right? And it made me question a lot of things, and it seems like we're working toward dismantling some institutions that oppress us, and that's exciting. However, for me as a young person just trying to figure out things, right, I'm thinking about the future, and that's legitimate. You know, I'm wondering, in a case that, like, if we abolish prisons and if we become very progressive, and how the future look like. I'm trying to picture it. A world without prison, without capitalism, without colonialization, without all these things that we working so hard to dismantle and maybe change. Are we trying to come with new institutions to replace these ones that already been corrupt? And also, another question, I think these institutions are a manifestation of our nature as human beings, that we have a lot of shortcomings. And I'm wondering, it has been a cycle of just having, you know, new institutions where we work at the beginning, a few centuries later, it's corrupt, and we have to replace it. And I think when the bourgeois started, they came from a good place. They were trying to fight the feudal system, and now it's so corrupt. So that's my question about the future and about just that cycle that, as far as I understand it, of like having these cycles that it start good and then eventually, you know, it's corrupt. Are we gonna stay in that cycle? And are we, yes, I'll leave it like that. Thank you.
Very minor questions to deal with. I mean, I think, I guess I want to kind of complicate the question about the future by talking a little bit more about what I've been learning from settler colonial studies, which is a particular investment in certain forms of temporal progression and an understanding of some kind of political recognition or recompense in the future is actually constitutive of an erasure of certain kinds of subjectivities that don't actually have access to futurity. In particular, settler colonial subjectivities that have maybe understood futurity as an untenable political horizon in some ways. So the question about what the future looks like is a very different question from different kinds of locations. And so I don't think it's answerable from any one location. And part of what I'm working on now in this new book project is actually a chapter called Against Longevity, which is really about trying to cut through some of these debates around queer futurity, no future, and queer utopia, by saying that one way of thinking through a solidarity politics is actually to understand that in the name of futurity, a lot of biopolitical violence happens on a daily basis. And that an alliance that understands those biopolitical violences needs to refuse, not in the kind of death drive way, but needs to refuse a politics of longevity that insists that one person's access to the future is at the expense of another person's access to the future. Yeah. So the question about the future is a relational one, and it's a biopolitical one, and it's not something that I think can be collectively answered unless we take up the problem of who has access to a future and who doesn't.
Yes.
The second question about institutions is also a really difficult and really hard and good question, and a deeply political question as well. It's your characterization of all institutions falling prey to the worst of itself is perhaps slightly pessimistic.
Yes, it is.
I don't know.
I'm not very hopeful.
I'm not known for my optimism, so so we, this is where really institutions will always discipline in a certain way, right? Institutions demand certain kinds of coherence, certain kinds of intelligibility, certain kinds of subjects that are produced through the relationship to that institution. So insofar as these different institutions are disciplinary projects, there's always going to be limitations to what can happen within certain kinds of institutional frames. And that includes queer institutional frames as well. It includes projects like women's studies, for example, or interdisciplinary projects that have been really at the heart of undermining and critiquing disciplinary hegemonic academic knowledge formations, and then are still deeply mired in kind of the reproduction of problematic discourses. So even the most progressive of institutions are going to have to deal with the problem of creating and disciplining subjects, right?
Do you think, does it always have to come at a very heavy cost of like this institution? I know they're not meant to stay forever, but they always end up bloody. Whenever we try to get rid of an oppressive institution, it's usually not non-violence. It's usually very at heavy cost. That we're trying to get rid of prison or whatever we're trying to get rid of, it's always at a heavy cost.
Do you have a particular institution in mind?
Slavery. It ended in civil war for 8 years. Millions of people got killed. And slavery was evil, but the cost to get rid of it was very heavy. And for me, that's why I'm not hopeful, because I feel that whenever we're trying to do progress, it's a cycle that never ends.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's what you're talking about is also the fantasy of progress, right? So the cycle you're describing already undermines a certain kind of fantasy about what we hope to think of as progress, right? So.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Doha. What's your name?
Hi, my name is Mo, the washing crimes to me is a new concept. Like started 6 years ago, I started learning about like how big evil companies do a lot of like big things, and they need sometimes a very strong detergent to wash their crimes. And since we're talking about pinkwashing, that means it's a very strong, has been effective sort of like detergent to wash like Israel's crimes. And in my understanding, that was because the sensitivity of the situation in the Middle East, for example, where a state of Israel, a state like the state of Israel can, for example, like claim that they're like a haven for homosexuals, for example, surrounded by all these enemies who are anti-homosexuals. But addressing the queer, gay, lesbian communities with those issues and make them more aware of the pinkwashing, whether, my question is whether this is more important than addressing, for example, the issue of, for example, like homophobia, which will make like pinkwashing less effective of a detergent. For example, instead of like focusing, of course, understanding the concept of pinkwashing by like the queer community will help them like defend themselves and not allow their cause, fair cause, for example, to be used to wash crimes that are imposed in other nations. But is it an effective tool as much as it will be if we went and addressed a broader community of homophobia, for example? I can, for example, as a Palestinian, I can go to the West Bank and start a month program where I will tell my people that Israel is actually using some of the comments that are considered anti-homosexuals that are released here and there from our community to justify the oppression of our people. And just because Israel is using this as a tool, let's not do that. And to me, talking about the pinkwashing to my people is better than talking about homophobia, because talking about homophobia in like conservative communities sort of like needs a lot of preparation for those communities not to react to the speaker and sometimes even lose your life trying to explain something because you don't put the words right and you did not consider like the complexity of like the socio-political environment that you're speaking to.
I mean, I'm not sure why this is an either-or situation.
Addressing, you know, the core question was, is it more effective to address like a queer community of pinkwashing than to like work on homophobia as a problem that makes other, like, for example, stronger political entities think of it as a good deterrent? Because, you know, right now, what makes it important is that a lot of like the homosexual issues are important things for a lot of progressive like countries, but not like in third world countries where those things are not as important.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily generalize the global South in that distinction in that way, but I also don't necessarily understand the attempts to address pinkwashing as somehow mutually exclusive from the efforts to navigate homophobia in our home communities, right? So it's a kind of multi-faceted battle whereby there needs to be a kind of addressing on multiple fronts of the different kinds of resistances that exist. So I don't think I understand how the two things can't happen at the same time. And it seems to me that a lot of organizing that's going on in the West Bank is precisely, in terms of Al-Quds and PQBDS, is precisely doing both of those things, actually, particularly PQBDS, by actually addressing a solidarity network in relation to forms of homophobia that might proliferate within those networks. So it seems to me that what you're asking about or what you're saying should be happening is actually happening.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Jean-Thomas.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm Jean-Thomas. I'm interested in the original terminology for assemblages, agencement, which you mentioned. And then you talked about patterns as one of the terms that could be useful in order to describe this. So I'd ask you to address two things. First of all, the role of aesthetics in assemblages. And second, well, to me, patterns denote some kind of repetition. So is there some kind of repetition that comes up in the formation or configuration of assemblages? And also, is there any relation to sameness in those kinds of repetitions that lead to assemblages?
Thanks for those, Jean-Thomas. Thanks for those questions. I haven't, in terms of your first question, the role of aesthetics, can you say a little bit more about what you're thinking about?
Yeah, so it's hard not to read Deleuze in relation, in terms of assemblages in French, not in relation to, okay, I'll start this again. When you read Deleuze in French, it's hard not to think of his work in film theory when you read about assemblages, because it's a very, it's a very visual and material and tangible form of vocabulary and lexicon that's being used, and it doesn't really come up in the Musumi translation, right? So if we see assemblages as patterns, well, can assemblages be aestheticized? And if they're aestheticized, do they remain assemblages, or have they become some kind of like narrative configuration? So the assemblage would just be about affect, and then the narrative configuration would be about emotion specifically, I guess.
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, it seems, I can't actually address that in terms of the genealogy that I also haven't read Deleuze and Guattari in French. I've barely read them in English. So, so I'm not, no, I mean, you know, it's how you read them. You barely read them, you know, because you kind of have to just keep reading them over and over again in different contexts and different order and whatever. So maybe that's a kind of aesthetic praxis of reading as well, right? That also can be undertaken in terms of like what it means to rethink reading practices around this language, this lexicon, this aesthetic understanding of assemblages, right? And in terms of patterns and repetition, I mean, I think that I'm not sure about the question of sameness. They really do steer away from sameness. Their preference is absolutely around the kind of variation to variation. And what patterning, by patterning, what they mean is really that the entities that come forth through the patterning are actually never repeated in some sense, right? That the what's giving rise to the entities are the patterns themselves, but there's no necessarily kind of continual repetition of either the pattern or the entities, because they're constantly reorganizing, reterritorializing, deterritorializing. So, I mean, I would stick with the understanding that there's always an interest in variation to variation. For Deleuze and Guattari, getting stuck on sameness is like the worst thing that could ever happen, right?
Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Thank you. What's your name, please?
Hi, Jordan. I was wondering, you mentioned at the beginning of your speech, you talked a little bit about the critique that you also make in the book about sort of intersectionality and the problems with that kind of approach to thinking about politics. And perhaps this is because you're being polite to your fellow activists, but you don't emphasize too much how this is in many ways a sort of dominant mode. Identity politics is sort of there's an industry for it, kind of in the blogosphere, in academia. To me, it's sort of the dominant mode of activism today. And so what I'm wondering is, in terms of assemblages, I see it as a descriptively useful way to move away from the intersectionality approach that you're critiquing. But I wonder, what does it offer us politically, and why is it superior to, for example, a more Marxist approach or some other way of thinking about politics that are not just identity politics?
Thank you for that question. That's the stuff that I'm working on in this book project that I'm finishing right now, which is really to think about intersectionality and assemblage together methodologically and politically. So not as one or the other being better than, well, one being better than the other, or one actually taking a certain kind of precedence over the other. The reason why I think intersectionality really needs to be rethought is first, from an institutional context. I think it's been wedded to the discipline or the interdiscipline of women's studies in a way that has closed off other kinds of research paradigms and methodologies. So I've been interested in kind of unyoking intersectionality from feminist theory to see what else might be a way of thinking through research projects. The problem with intersectionality is, just as you've said, it reintroduces the subject, right? It reintroduces the subject of identity, and the subject that has an identity. And so the critique of identity politics, in a way, has to then take on a critique of intersectionality as well. And I think, you know, there are obviously things that intersectionality does and does really well. Part of that has been about showing up showing us from Kimberly Crenshaw's original formulation the ways in which legal frameworks do not function intersectionally, right? So we see something like the Tyler Clementi, the Arun Ravi, what happens with that particular tragedy is really an inability to attend to the complexity of intersectional identities, but not just that, right? And so that's where I think assemblage theory comes in, to remind us that these are largely partial and inefficient and still disciplinary formations, and that you can intersectionalize the subject all you want, but there's still going to be the function of the disciplining of the subject at work, right? And then just, you know, to to highlight, for example, the work of Ray Chow, that there's always going to be a new intersectional coordinate that needs to be, or a new intersectional subject that needs to be attended to. So there's a kind of endless array, which he says there's, subject X might be different in content, but shows up time and time again in the same form. So in some senses, intersectionality makes it, it has also become a kind of, like you said, a kind of mainstreamed political lexicon in some senses, right? It's being used by, in UN language, it's being used in NGO language. And in that sense, it resonates a little bit with Scott Morganson's understanding of a citational politics that doesn't actually change the structures of inequality that it is attempting to address. And if you look at the history of intersectionality in women's studies, what's happened is that it's actually allowed for an alibi for white feminists who can continue to not work on race or work on women of color. And the majority of work on women of color continues to be produced by women of color, right? So you have a politics of recognition that doesn't actually change the kind of economic and political structure of inequality underneath it. And I think that your question about why assemblage and why not other kinds of Marxist frames is very reasonable. I'm not advocating assemblage as a kind of political, heaven or anything. It's hardly that. It's mired in its own institutional histories, right? But I will say that one thing that intersectionality has done from the vantage point of feminist Marxists is that it's actually culturalized a kind of economic approach to inequity, basically, so that, again, the politics of recognition substitutes in for a real rethinking of what are the forces of economic stratification, right? So again, it's not so much about intersectionality as a conceptual frame per se, but how it's been deployed. And in that respect, assemblage theory is susceptible, absolutely, to the same thing. There's no reason why assemblage theory is inherently better. It depends on how it is being deployed and in what context. And for that reason, I'm really interested in thinking the two things together, because I think that we need creative methodologies and creative political approaches.
Okay, thank you. Next.
Hey, my name is Mark Bukai. I guess my question, first of all, the Biden quote about transness I'd not heard before, and I've been very smitten with it. And I guess in relationship to that, with the comment that we just had about this whole pessimistic view of the world, what happens if we get rid of institutional structures, and you talked about the fantasy of progress, right? In that same way, a lot of people on the right use the nightmare of progress to push very, use the idea of the nightmare of progress to frighten us into not making certain changes. I'm talking about, again, what's called the Pibbs argument. If you allow gay marriage, next will be polygamy, followed by incest, followed by bestiality. The slippery slope argument, if you will, to Kurt Weill and Brecht's mahogany, once you open up the floodgates. So I guess what I'm wondering is, if it's not a fantasy and it's not a nightmare, what kind of version of the world are we trying to come up with if it's not the Berlant good life kind of race-blind, gay-friendly, but within a kind of homonational framework vision of the world, and it's not a Sodom and Gomorrah pile of insanity, then what is it that we're trying to envision?
Yet another basic easy question. I mean, I think that's a collective conversation. I think it's a conversation that people have been having here over the past couple days and will continue to have. It's a conversation that people have in many locations. I've been living and teaching in Beirut this year, and it's a conversation that looks very different in different places. So I feel like what I do as a theorist and as an activist and an academic is try to break open things such that new conversations and new paradigms can emerge. And I feel like that might be the most generative thing that we can do as people who are producing concepts and trying to produce possibilities for alliance and conversation and dialogue. And I think that the aim of that is, again, not necessarily to produce a common vision, but to produce the possibility of new conversations that might engender new possible alliances and new openings around what it means to think of something as political, or what it means to call, what it means to say this is the vision that we have. So, I really do hesitate in terms of like proffering a vision. It seems really not wise.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Next.
Okay, my question is about, I guess, the fear of being labeled a bigot and the fear of bigotry, and kind of how to deal with that. But then you were kind of talking about, when you were talking about intersectionality earlier, you talked a little bit about intersectionality. It's like, how do people with privilege try to approach their own privilege, and how does the fear of becoming a bigot or being labeled a bigot end up working into things like pinkwashing? And it's like, to me, like a lot of that seems to be built off of this self-aggrandizement that's necessary for people to be able to survive with or for people to feel okay about themselves. So, you have people of privilege talk about their relative lack of privilege, so they'll find the thing that they lack privilege in, that'll be the thing they focus on, and then they avoid the things, approaching things that they don't have their privilege in. So how do you deal with that?
I mean, I think what you're talking about is what I've been calling self-subalternization. I think many of us are guilty of self-subalternization, and that we have to be really attentive to the kind of attachment, wounded attachment narrative and the kind of politics of injury, or the politics of narrating oneself continually from a wounded attachment or a space of injury. I think Wendy Brown wrote this piece in 1995, and everyone was really upset with her because she was criticizing women's studies for its attachment, its wounded attachment. But I think she was right, and she continues to be right, that a politics organized through wounded attachments, as opposed to a politics that starts from the recognition of one's privilege, will really continually reiterate a victimhood paradigm that ultimately is going to continue to produce suffering and pain and ostracization in some ways. I'm not sure what your bigot question is about. But I'm sorry you're worried about that, but if that's your biggest problem, I
didn't mean to like say like as a personal thing. It just seems to me that people are afraid of being labeled a bigot so much that they avoid, or like they'll do a lot of things to avoid it, and including building up or creating demons in other people, and I don't know. That's just all.
I mean, it seems to me that what my work has been focused on all along is really to get away from those kinds of accusatory politics and think through what it means to not be focused on a kind of complicity versus resistance kind of circuitry. So we're all implicated. We're all implicated. So the question is how? How are we implicated differently? And what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
Thank you. Before we continue, anyone else who wants to ask a question, please stand up now, and then we're going to lock the lines, okay? Sappho. Actually, these people were waiting first, and then Nick Naz got online. I'm on top of it. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Hi. So I was, oops, sorry. I was really intrigued by what you referred to as the trans homonationalism, which I also spoke about in my presentation. And or as I said earlier, unfortunately, the word transnationalism is already taken.
Sorry, I missed that. What was
that? I said, no, it was just a joke. Unfortunately, the word.
Oh, I need to hear it.
Oh, unfortunately, the word transnationalism is already taken. So.
I see. I know I had that problem too, and I was trying to figure that out. Yeah.
So, I mean, I was curious. I mean, thinking about these questions of temporalities, which keep coming up, in terms of everything, really. But I mean, one of these temporalities that we see here, is sort of, first there's women, and then there's queer, and then there's trans, which is something that, and there's this ongoing antagonism between queer studies and trans studies. And I've been thinking, there's sort of one of the critiques that I've had, with a lot of the texts that have been written about homonationalism, including Terrorist Assemblages and Joseph Massad's writing, is that it's again recapitulating this trend within queer studies that reduces the queer or the LGBT to being about sexuality, as opposed to the other the questions of gender ontologies that the trans subject brings up. And then so now there's this trans, homonationalist incitement to discourse, like you identified, and it seems like, is there this call and response? Is this the entry point now that we can talk about trans subjectivities within the assemblage of homonationalism? Because that's sort of like, did we have to wait for Joseph Biden to say that before, before we can talk about, how trans subjects are implicated in homonationalism and sort of the larger questions of, where does a trans narrative, especially because, there's a critique of the coming out narrative as a Western imperial narrative. Mm-hmm. It's also a cis narrative, right? And so the question of doing solidarity work and what does it mean to have the privilege to be out means something very different if you're talking about a trans subjectivity. So I'm sort of curious, where do these different bits and pieces fit together?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about all of these questions a lot. I've been working on a chapter on trans and disability, because part of what happens in the 90s is that both of these identity paradigms start being taken up in academia and from social movements, and I've been thinking about what the relationship is, and in some ways, the trans follows through on one teleology that I mentioned, right, that you've just reiterated. But the other teleology that is not so often invoked would be from the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act, right, and how trans bodies actually are the kind of non-normative bodies that are engaging with the medical industrial complex in certain ways, that then distinguishes them from other kinds of normative queer bodies, right? And that has to, that's a different teleology, right? It's not a teleology that gets to be produced through exceptionalizing, narratives. So it's So there's just a question right there too of why certain kinds of subjectivities come into the purview of the state at certain moments or get taken up in relation to the state at certain moments, and others don't, or others do, but not in relation to certain kinds of teleologies. I would say, I mean, the homonationalism quest, the homosexual question is actually a variant of the woman question insofar as it reiterates the terms of gender normativity, right? So the homosexual question understands that the trans is not the homosexual in question, right? That the state is invested in. So Biden's, invocation highlights, on some level, it's just kind of shocking to think that Joe Biden knows what transgender is, right? You're just like, what? What is going on here? So there's already that kind of weird disappointment around that, right? But I think that, I would want to resist. I don't feel defensive about terrorist assemblages in this manner. I didn't take up trans as an identity marker, but the book really is about gender normativity. The whole book is, and so insofar as these figures are constantly morphing into each other and are relational and relating back to each other and continue to elide, in particular, women of color, certain kinds of subjects that are particularly in this teleology are produced as having been taken care of or having gotten their rights, that we have to, it's this telos is something that we can continually challenge and continually loop our efforts, right? So is there a trans homonationalism? Well, only if we're not paying attention to all the elisions that kind of homonationalism would entail, right? Which would mean like the elisions around feminist organizing. I mean, what happened to the feminist critique of marriage? What happened to that, So these are the kinds of things that we have to keep going back to, right? To kind of complicate what it means to engage with a trans homonationalism. And I think, I don't think that's a very satisfactory answer to your not so much of a question, but kind of laying out of issues. But these are questions on the horizon. Like, how do we resist a kind of exceptionalizing of identity, right? Because that's what the state is doing. The state wants us to respond through identity to this fantasy of its exceptionalizing capacity, right? And resisting that means disengaging from identity itself.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jean? Actually, you were online first, believe me.
For keeping track of that.
Okay.
And thank you for answering all these questions with such, thanks for answering all these questions with such panache. I'm very excited to hear about how settler colonialism and indigenous studies can help us think through homonationalism, especially in the North American context. And I suppose in North America, settler colonialism is always already transnational. But I'm thinking of, what about maybe the Caribbean? Have you maybe thought about how indigenous studies can be, that has generally come from North America, can be then translated to a region like that is transnational in so many ways. Mm-hmm. So I'm very interested to see how you might speak to that.
No, I have not thought of that.
Fair enough.
It's a great question. And obviously, when we're talking about thinking through indigenous studies and questions of nationalism, like, they're just so many places that can be reworked around this. Latin America, obviously. So there's so many avenues of thought here. I mean, I guess what I would just want to reiterate is not just for the North American context, but it seems to me that one way that we can historicize homonationalism and really make it a kind of critical analytic around nationalism is to really interrogate the founding principles of a national formation, whether that national formation is in the Caribbean or in North America or in Latin America or in South Asia, that the structuring violences that found a nation are then going to be drawn through the fabric of that population and that national constituency in ways that cannot necessarily be easily dismissed as a kind of historical, oh, that happened hundreds of years ago, right? And I think that's what settler colonial studies and indigenous studies is also showing us, that the understanding of settler colonialism in the historical past is unacceptable because it doesn't actually then account for the structuring forces of violence that allow us to occupy and inhabit an attachment to our nation states, right? So that's the thing that I think is most powerful about what homonationalism as a critique could become, which is really about not exceptionalizing this particular moment, but actually more capaciously understanding a kind of historical trajectory through which this particular moment then can be seen as somehow exceptional, but is actually not.
That's lovely. Thank you.
Okay, Nicholas, hi.
Hi. I am trying to understand actually the capacious concept of homonationalism you're suggesting. So I have a couple of questions to just clarify the notion. And I just want to know if it seems that you are suggesting that homonationalism is actually a central feature of nationalism currently, and also broadly modernity and even imperial projects. So that centrality is something that I kind of is hard to be convinced of, and I just want to do more to expand on, rather than like a marginal form of nationalism that is being deployed in different contexts and currently as a broader form of nationalism that is profoundly still heteronationalist, basically. And also that doesn't that if that is what you're suggesting, to imagine that we are currently, let's say in the United States, are in a homonationalist moment, kind of makes that presumption of, again, the US being the place for homosexual, like the kind of, the place that homosexuality is actually even achieved, that level of norm that is becoming common. That was one question. And then the same question, when thinking historically, as you were saying, like how to think about it historically. So are you suggesting that is it a recent phenomenon or not, in the sense that if you were talking about slavery, even history is back to slavery, and how those moments, in fact, the nationalism, European nationalism, wasn't quite, I mean, it was very hetero-nationalist. In fact, others were often cast as like having same-sex in ways, or being sodomites in other parts of the world, or other non-civilized people. So how are you tracing that history of homonationalism back to then? So, I mean, this is, and then finally, isn't this...
Maybe we just go in stages here.
Okay.
What do you think? What do you think? Can we just do that? Question. No, you're the last questioner.
No, this.
Oh no, there's one more.
Yeah.
No. It's good. It's all good. But I really want to address your questions because they're fantastic. But I'm gonna lose them. So I want to hear your last question too.
Okay, the last question.
No, not now.
No. Okay,
Okay, first I want to address 1 and 2, and then we'll get to 3,
I've
right?
been standing for a long time.
I have been standing here a long time, too.
I'm kidding.
We're in this, we're standing together. Okay, so your first question about modernity and the centrality of homonationalism and whether or not it reproduces the US as a particular kind of dominant site. What homonationalism is not another way of saying this is gay nationalism or this is a gay who is nationalist. Homonationalism is more about being able to articulate a historical shift in the way in which people are thinking about how nations gain a certain kind of legitimacy and a certain kind of recognition for forms of liberal tolerance, democracy, etc. So, in brief, why is it that now we use the status of homosexuality to evaluate what kind of country we're dealing with? This is not a question. So the question is, you know, we had the woman question, how well do you treat your women? How well do you treat your women and children? Now we have this question, how well do you treat your homosexuals, right? This is not a question that was articulated 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago. So on a very basic level, homonationalism is about being able to historicize that shift, okay? Does that answer number 1?
Yeah, I mean, yes. there are moments when you explain that it feels like, in the example, sometimes it's like the still marginality of that to a broader project. When domestically speaking, sometimes I was like...
I don't think I would say I don't think of it as a marginal project because it's a global discourse now. And it is a global discourse that's been engendered by the dominance of the US and the dominance of Israel around a lot of these issues, and also Europe. But it is a global question, right? So we now, you know, apparently hand out aid to countries based on whether or not homosexuality is legal, right? There are parameters through, this was unthinkable 20 years ago, right? So that's the shift that homonationalism marks.
There are also a lot of occasions when actually the United States has supported a lot of, it hasn't been that even, right? There has been a lot of...
It is hardly even. Right. It is hardly even.
And what is happening in Uganda has been productive.
This is why homonationalism is an assemblage and not an identity, because there's no stability around this either, right? The good homonationalist queer can easily become a bad, you know, a bad queer in an instant, right? Depending on circumstance and where and how, right? So these are very tenuous moments of inclusion in a national formation. It's not solid at all, and we know that in the United States because we have these discourses around liberal tolerance, and then we also have hate crimes and gay suicides and all this other stuff, right? So homonationalism is not about producing a kind of coherent narrative or homogenizing the unevenness, but it is about how the narrative of progress works to secure various kinds of national evaluations of identity, right? Now I have forgotten your second question. So maybe in 2 sentences, your second question.
Historically tying it to older...
Oh, okay. So say a little bit more again about your question.
I was just wondering, you were whether homonationalism can be kind of traced even to histories of slavery, and where I was thinking that in fact, people with same-sex sexualities were cast as uncivilized, and European sexuality, dominant nationalism was very heterosexual.
Yeah, this is where I think, you know, we would want to parse out the emergence of the concept and the term homonationalism and what it has come to resonate with and mark, things that were already in process, and then many forms of scholarship that have addressed exactly what you're talking about, that there are many convivial relations and conversations that can be had. Do we need to call everything homonationalism? No, absolutely not. I think what I was trying to point to was that there are all sorts of earlier histories that actually then lead to this particular moment, right? Whereby there's a kind of concretization of a certain kind of phenomena that's been happening in various ways, in a multitude of ways, but now has a certain kind of intensity or a certain kind of force to it. Again, I wouldn't want to exceptionalize now. So this then is about taking critical stock of what the concept of homonationalism might cover over, what it might occlude, what we might be forgetting about by focusing on this, right? So, I mean, as someone who is trained in theorizing nationalism and sexuality 20 years ago, all I read was all of this work on nationalism and sexuality, different contexts, different historical periods, et cetera, et cetera. So in some ways, my thinking is deeply indebted to all of that work that has been done. And so those historical paradigms are unto themselves relevant. They don't need homonationalism to be illuminated, right? Okay. And the third question?
It's okay, I think other people are ready.
So we have Rebecca, and then the person you cited 4 times wants to ask you a question, so he has to get a little... Okay, so Rebecca.
Good, I'm really glad I'm not going to be last, because it's actually a very small comment to expand one thing that you said about the feeling like we're losing the history of the critiques of the same-sex marriage movement in Hawaii, and then I wanted to actually even just expand on that in terms of what it meant that Vermont then moved forward with those. It was the same.
Are you from Vermont?
Well, but I'm going to agree with you, but I am. No, but I'm from Vermont, and I'm white, and it is one of the whitest states. All of that's true, but
I'm so sorry.
there, no. But there also it was a proxy fight for something else. It was a proxy fight that I can't condense into something that makes a lot of sense here, but that was decades of a fight about if people would make money from farming or from tourism, and who was on the side of farming were mostly the poor people and that had been made poor from the state of farming, and so it was a proxy fight there as well, and in winning first the civil unions in '97 and then later same-sex marriage, it sort of cemented the Vermont brand that I think we all probably know very well, right, of this, exactly what you're saying, recognition for a certain type of liberalism and who should be attracted to that space. So it's that story through and through, including there, is all I wanted to add.
Well, thank you. That kind of farming versus tourism thing helps, embellish Vermont as a space.
Good. Anyway, I'm glad I'm not laughing.
And my apologies to you about my Vermont slam, but
No, that wasn't.
And finally.
Hello, Scott.
Hi, Scott.
Hi, Jasbir. I was really excited that you brought up the need for Indigenous studies or settler colonial studies to engage with Black diaspora criticism. I would frame it
to engage with what?
Black diaspora criticism, but more specifically with the question of slavery and the Constitution of the United States through its structural violence against people of the African diaspora. And I was just thinking about how my colleagues, Kealani Kauanui today earlier, commented precisely on this point that was so, we've all feeling we've been struggling around, this sense of sometimes historical and sometimes in terms of how it gets brought up, a sense of present disjuncture between Black studies and Indigenous studies, or between theories of coloniality and decoloniality that can emerge from the Black Atlantic paradigm versus through the transnational Indigenous decolonization paradigm. And so I just think it's a really important moment where people are thinking a lot about this. And Coley Driscoll also spoke about this a little bit earlier, about the specific histories of relationality and the experiences of being caught up complicitly in white supremacist settler colonialism for Native American and African American peoples throughout the history of chattel slavery in the southeastern nations, or then conversely, the histories of African American participation in settlement and in soldiering during the conquest of the plains in the West. So, people are there's a lot of really great stuff going on, and I just thought I'd bring that up because it's also weighing on me, and it's really kind of focusing how I'm thinking about what my work needs to be doing right now. And a place that it's going for me was, and actually the reason why I wanted to come up is because it kind of addresses the question about the Caribbean. Hi. Hey, Jean Scott, nice to meet you too. And it's a really important question, I think, not only because, like one of the dangers that can happen, I think we're noticing in folk settler colonial studies in North America and Indigenous scholars doing Indigenous studies transnationally, is that while people are attempting to hold the United States, or even sometimes just Canada, to a kind of a provincializing critique of its specific national formation, the hegemony of North American discourse internationally actually elevates that to a kind of a seeming significance or an over-signification in the question of settler colonialism or of indigeneity in a global sense. And so like NASA, Native American Indigenous Studies, has to struggle around this, but working really productively to make sure the Pacific, histories are not being marginalized as a result. And this also comes up around the efforts on the part of scholars from Abya-Yala, which is how people are identifying themselves within the conference and within the organization, from South America and the Caribbean and Latin America, to bring those perspectives into the discussion. So I'll just say that one of the books that I've run into recently that seems to be doing a lot of this work really well is Shona Jackson's Creole Indigeneity, and I just wanted to mark that for people to read, and I'm really interested in it myself. And I'll end with a question. So that's great that you're gonna, sorry, would you like to comment on that one first before I?
It depends what your question is.
It's a different question, so it's a different topic, so.
Oh, it is?
Any
okay.
reflections
so
you have
maybe,
on that would be great.
I guess this stuff has been bothering me for a while. I mean, Terrorist Assemblages was really produced in the middle of this post 9/11 moment where all of this stuff was happening around Muslim bodies, right? And so the book has the intensity of that moment and also the elisions of that moment embedded in it, which, was kind of, in some ways, already mapped out from the moment September 11th happened around this move from driving while black to flying while brown, right? So the move from the precarious body being a black body to being a brown body. And I think that this has been really difficult to try to untangle, and really complicated in terms of class and economic structures and disenfranchisement and citizenship, and has invoked, it invoked, the kinds of struggles around African Americans and enslaved population, formerly enslaved populations, and immigrant communities and immigrant rights. And so all of that stuff is all of those tensions and all of those political, irreconcilable in some ways, political antagonisms and upsets are really rife in the kind of quote-unquote post-9/11 literature. And then I think we're out of a post 9/11 moment. I think we are in a kind of post 2008 moment, or in the 2008 moment, the financial crisis moment, whereby who we're thinking about in terms of precarity has shifted again, is shifting again, and I think it's constantly shifting. And so part of my thinking around this, flying, this driving and flying thing, right? So part of my thinking around that has really been about how can we honor the different variable precarities of different populations, different bodies, without essentializing and without competitively hierarchizing who needs what, and yet still attending to the specificity of various forms of precarity. And I think it's really politically difficult and really intellectually difficult as well. And it seems to me that there's, in that kind of post 9/11 moment, there's been a backlash around the post 9/11 moment, right? And kind of saying the analyses that came out of September 11th forgot who the really precarious bodies are, right? And instead of saying something like, who are the really precarious bodies, to try to think about how the precarity is mutually implicated, not in Judith's kind of, we're all, dealing with precarious bodies, but really that we're like, I'm not going to say anything more about that, but anyway, she's talking about ontology, obviously, and I'm talking about biopolitics, but to really think about how we're biopolitically implicated in various kinds of precarity. So I really wanted to attend to that around homonationalism, because in the book, there isn't, there's a focus on a certain moment and a certain kind of body or sets of bodies that were being drawn in. But we shouldn't then take that framing as somehow something that we want to continually reiterate as the body that's being exempted out of this project, right, of gay rights, right? And so, and at this conference, it was kind of manifest at this conference that everyone is moving with that capacious paradigm, right? And then I just want to say one last thing, which is in academic conversations, it seems to me that there's a kind of struggle going on, or maybe not struggle, but there's some discussion about the rise of settler colonial studies and indigenous studies. It seems to me a very late rise, given what we know historically. It's kind of shocking to me. So that the rise should then become a problem in terms of rethinking the primal scenes of racism that are not just about Blackness, but are also about Native American genocide, seems a little shocking to me, but it does seem like there's been some of that. And I think that to take on the structuring forces of the US, the formation of the US nation, is really about both, because one is enacted as the primal scene of racism in order to forget the other primal scene of racism, right? And so these two foundations can actually work together. If we interrogate them together, they can work together to think through how we are already set up to say, where's the original injury? And we don't have to do that. So that's my thinking on this stuff, and that's a lot of what I've been working out around homonationalism as well.
Great. You actually just answered my question, so thank you.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so efficient.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Good night.